All right, well, welcome to today's Lunch and Learn series. Today we're talking about communicating controversies and teaching tough subjects. So it's going to be a fun one today. Thank you very much for those who are attending. Hopefully we leave here today with some interesting conversations and some cool tools that we can all use, maybe even in our everyday lives. Okay. So before we get started, my name is Amber Schiltz. I'm the Wildlife Education Program Manager. I work for the Fish and Wildlife Education Division here at Nebraska Game Parks. And we put on these Lunch and Learn series once a month for the agency. It just really is a professional development series and really to instill kind of a growth mindset culture. I really enjoy bringing science and education related topics, to our agency and to others, and to just really see what's out there to improve what we do to work for our mission here. And there's really fascinating research out there on a lot of these cool topics, and it's exciting to learn more about them and see how we can put them into practice. My co-host today is Grace. Grace, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Grace Gard. I'm the Aquatic Ecology Education Specialist with the Fish and Wildlife Education Division. So excited to help Amber out today.
Thanks, Grace. And if you have any questions as we go forward, she'll be looking at the chat, but we'll definitely stop and pause. There'll be some polls, there'll be some time for discussion. I'm also gonna utilize some Jamboard today, so I'm excited for those kind of things. So before we get started, this is the rest of the series. We do have the rest of the year planned out. So today's topic is the chatting about controversies and tough subjects. The next one is in July. So we have creating engaging virtual programs. And then the next one will be engaging our audience through social media. In September, we'll have a guest speaker from the University of Nebraska, a climate scientist, and he's going to be talking to us about understanding and communicating climate change. So that'll be good. October, we're going to be talking about community science and what that means for our agency and some really great opportunities there. And then in November, we'll be talking about storytelling in science. And then to close out the year, we're going to be talking about the education strategic plan and kind of a recap over the last few years of what has happened with that. So with that, just as a reminder, I'm recording this today. These will be available. They're all recorded and available on our YouTube channel, so you can watch them or you can use them in further training opportunities for any staff or anything like that. And then I always send out an evaluation. I really enjoy hearing from you. What was valuable to you? What is something that you took away? What are some different topics that we can be sharing about to help you in this series? Okay, so this particular topic is kind of interesting because it kind of goes across many different divides. It goes across science, education, communications, and really anything that we're doing, and maybe any of us in any role we play. And so just to preface, I'm really not trying to bring this to anybody today to train us on or talk about how we all can go out and start talking about controversial subjects within Nebraska Game Parks, to constituents or anything like that. That there's definitely specific protocols for that. What I'm really here today for, and my goal is just to get us to be thinking about how and why we enter difficult conversations in a more broad sense, especially those controversial science conversations, right? So we know we're living in a more polarized world, but really at the end of the day, there's actually science brings more unity than I think that we think. And so it's about kind of leaning in and just having those civil discourses with people that we might not agree with, but just being curious and staying objective and listening. And so I'm really hoping to kind of go over and learn with you all about some really cool, useful tools that anyone can employ when having those conversations, just to learn from one another and to have, that civil discourse. So some of the topics that we're going to talk about today, the challenges. So what challenges are we facing? And just to reiterate, I'm really talking about science communication, really. We're talking about those science topics that are deemed controversial. So the challenges in science communication these days, and then what hat to wear, specifically if we're working for Nebraska Game Parks, what kind of hat are we wearing? What's our need and our role in these kind of conversations? Some considerations that we need to think about before even, wrapping our minds around some of the methods, and then going into some methods and practices of how to have these difficult conversations, or how to best help people and stay objective and listen and learn from one another. And then we'll do some reflection and questions. Okay, so some of the challenges. So there's lots of changing trends in how we as a society get our information today. And a lot of these things that I'm going to be speaking to probably are pretty intuitive and probably not news to many of you. But it's really interesting to just think about and consider in the larger picture of things, of where we are in the state of where people are getting their information, specifically about science. And so obviously we're trending away from traditional media to more the online format. And when I say traditional media, I'm talking about the newspapers and TV. So according to one of the polls that I was researching, Americans report that their primary source of news in 2001, 9% of Americans reported that it was the internet. In 2014, it was 47%. And so you can see just in that short amount of time, nearly half of Americans report that their primary source of news is the internet. It's no longer their primary source is newspaper or TV or science magazines or things like that. And so it's not a good or a bad thing. It's just something to keep in mind as a framework of how we move forward with that. News holes, this was really interesting. I don't know if I realized this. There's actually just shrinking amount of time on the TV in general for news at large, not just science news. So there's shrinking amount of time, and there's also shrinking amount of literal column inches in print for news and for science news. For example, in 1989, across the United States, there were 95 newspapers that had a dedicated weekly science section. And in 2012, there were 19. That was down to 19. And so you can see the trend, at least specifically for science in the news, is it's definitely going down. And so where are people getting their science news? It's something that we really need to think about. Where are they getting, that information that they use to build their worldview? Another trend is science journalism. It's probably obvious why this is from the first two, but there's a shrinking number of employed science journalists. Science journalists play a critical role in the the world at large, because they not only are they talented in journalism and communications and writing or even education perhaps, but they also specifically have that knowledge of science, and they have a good enough background to be able to report on it well and to understand the nuances and to make it accessible and translate it to the general public. Whereas maybe other more general journalists or different types of journalists might not have that specific knowledge. So where are people getting, or at least Americans, getting their science and technology information? This is according to a poll in 2015. 50% from search engines, which that makes sense. So I'm sure we can all think of the one that pops in my mind, at least, is Google. 40% is Facebook. That's something right there to think about. And then 30% is conversations with family and friends. So again, I'm not saying this is either bad or good. It's just good to understand the trends. It's good to understand the landscape of where people are getting, their ideas, their views, and getting their understanding of science really outside of that elementary school, outside of that formal education on science. So because we're really trending towards the new media, the online media challenges, or the online media format for most of our news, in particular also our science news, there's a lot of pros to that, I will say. There are challenges, but there are some pros to that. There's more accessibility than ever. So there's more accessibility. Say you have different scientists now that are talking about their work directly to people. Maybe they have Twitter, maybe they have their own YouTube channels, maybe they have their own social media. And so that accessibility factor is there. So that's really cool and that is really exciting. But with that, there are also challenges. There are way more actors in the field now. And so where you might have, for example, a geologist with a YouTube channel, and he or she is talking about all these really cool different things and studies and things they're finding, you might just on that same level have someone, let's say, like selling crystals and maybe saying that they might know the science of it and maybe not necessarily saying actual accurate science, but they're on the same level as that actual accurate science, right? And so there's just way more actors in the field now. And so that is a challenge. The framing of science in the news can be a challenge. Often journalists they need a story to report on. And so if you think about the way science works, science is often, it's not a clean and cut, process. It can be messy. It can be, there's trials, there's all these different things. And so when it does come to finding a story in it, often it's, maybe it's because it's a new discovery, so that's exciting, or maybe it's because there's something political happening that you pull in the science to talk about it. And so then because there are less science journalists and there's way more political journalists or other general journalists, they're going to naturally just report on that science in that way. Maybe they'll put a political stance on it, or maybe they will automatically frame it in a way that poses more of an ethical quandary than it has. And so just that framing is different. Echo chamber and filter bubble. This is a really big one. So a pro to online format of how we access our information is that accessibility. If any of us right now have a smartphone in our pocket or at our desk, we have access to all the world's knowledge that has ever been discovered, right? How exciting is that? Exciting time to be alive. Unfortunately, and interestingly enough, it's never been easier to put on our own blinders to things that maybe we don't agree with or that we don't really like. We do this ourselves. We can do it on social media, on Facebook, on different things where if we start to hide things, it picks up on our preferences. And so these algorithms just start to show us things only that we know that we like. So that's our own echo chamber. We're not really exposed to things that have differing views. But this also happens sometimes without our knowledge. It's called the filter bubble. When we use search engines such as Google, they actually consider our ad preferences, all our different preferences, even our data, and they think about our preferences, and those preferences actually influence our search results. So depending on what I like, what my political leanings are, and everything that a search engine might know about me, I know it's a scary thought, but it's just the world we live in. And I type in, let's say, climate change, and let's say someone who's very different than me and has very different hobbies and political leanings and all these things right next to me types in climate change, we might get very different results because of this filter bubble, because they're showing us different things because of our preferences. So that's something to be mindful of as well. The perception of social norms is really interesting on the online media format as well. This has to do with thinking about, like I said, that accessibility is really exciting. I'm thinking about YouTube channels, I'm thinking about Twitter, I'm thinking about all these things, that immediate social feedback of news stories now, the likes and the views, you can see it quantified now. That actually has an effect on how people then think about that story. So if you compare, let's say, a story on a discovery of something exciting in science in a newspaper article, you are reading it objectively and then you take in that information. You're not getting the feedback from that, right? Whereas now in an online media format, if you're reading that article, let's say on Facebook, you're seeing all the comments, or you're seeing how much it's shared. You're seeing all these things. Well, research is actually showing that the number of views or likes on videos or posts, they actually cue social norms. And so maybe, for an example, a YouTube video talking about how climate change makes people feel if it has a lot of views, if it has more views than another YouTube video on, you know, climate change facts, maybe from NASA or something like that, from an expert, the video with more views is going to have more of an influence on people watching it than maybe one with actual accurate information. So it's really interesting to kind of consider that. The nasty effect, this is another interesting phenomena that researchers are discovering. And this has to do with, again, that social feedback that we are seeing live, you know, that live commentary on the news, on science news. And so what they have found is that when we're exposed to uncivil reader comments on objective scientific reporting, I'm sure none of us have gone down the rabbit hole of reading comments on certain issues that we care about before, right? That's a really fun waste of an afternoon. But anyways, when we are exposed to uncivil reader comments, it can actually increase our perception of bias in the story itself. So it can actually make us think, oh, maybe there are two sides of this. Maybe this is really controversial. Maybe this really is a polarizing subject, when in fact the story itself really was objective and there wasn't a lot of controversy to that science. So just really interesting things to think about. And one more thing, that knowledge gap equity, there's, and this is really important as we move towards, you know, really thinking about diversity and inclusion, especially within our agency. New media formats are widening the knowledge gap between the less advantaged populations and populations with higher socioeconomic status, or even populations with higher education. So that's something to be mindful of, you know, who has access to that information. Why is that important? Because this gap can then reinforce status quo differences. When we think about resources and participation from everybody, we want participation from everyone when we have crucial conversations as a society, when it relates to science, you know, in the future. And so these are just some things to think about with the new kind of media challenges of science information. So what shapes our beliefs when we take in all this information? There used to be a thought of it was called the deficit model. So the idea was, if the public is skeptical of science, it's just because we don't understand. And so how do we change that? Well, we give them more facts. Information is going to make change happen. And all we need to do is like yell louder about it and give them more accurate information, and then everything will be fine. But as they put science to science communication, they realized that that was actually inaccurate, because it's really not how people think. It's not how people form their beliefs. It's not how people influence their own behavior. It's not just information, right? So we're social creatures, so we really relate to social knowledge. We relate more to people stories and narratives than we do to abstract concepts, right? We remember objects and concepts more easily in a social context. And we think in cause and effect. We seek patterns. And a lot of times those patterns are tied to emotions and how we're feeling. We think about how we feel about stories more, and that influences our behaviors more than just information. Some information might. So knowing all this is really helpful going forward in like addressing the challenge of how do we talk about science in this day and age. I'm going to pause. That was a lot of information that I just kind of threw at everybody. Are there any questions?
There's nothing in the chat so far.
Okay, awesome. All right. So what hat do we wear? And this is just going to preface before I move forward and talk about some great tools and methods that are backed by science of how to have some difficult conversations and controversial science topics. But before we even go there, I want to kind of think about, like, I want you to think about what role you play. And maybe you play a variety of roles. You can think about what role you play here as you work for Nebraska Game Parks in the agency, or maybe you play a different role when you go home, or maybe you are on a board or an organization or a volunteer. So you might play different roles. But I want you to be thinking about that and being mindful, because depending on that role is how you would move forward with some of the methods and tools we're going to chat about. So the first one is just a resource provider. And what I'm thinking about is if you work in customer service, if you work at a park, if you work somewhere where you're going to see members of the public a lot, and you might get questions, you might get comments, you might get complaints, but your role maybe isn't necessarily to have all the answers, and you certainly won't have all the answers, and you shouldn't feel like you need to. Really then your job is just to listen respectfully, to thank them for their questions and concerns, and then just point them in the right direction of where they can find the resources, or at least let them know, thank you for your concern, I'll make sure to pass that on. And so that's kind of, that role right there, what hat you might wear in that situation. And then the rest of the talk really is talking about these methods that you might employ if you are these other two roles. If you are a subject matter expert, so say you're a scientist or a biologist, or you're in leadership, you're an engineer or a planner, you're some kind of decision maker, or you play a more broad role, in something to do with those roles. Or you are maybe not a subject matter expert, but your job or your role is to disseminate that information. Your job is to get that information to people, whether that's outreach, interpretation, or education. Maybe you're a science educator, a naturalist interpreter, science communicator, a science writer. This applies to Game and Parks, but a lot of what I'm speaking to applies wider than that as well. So before we get started, some considerations. What are our goals of communicating science, even in controversial situations, right? So thinking about defining your goals and your purpose is super important before you enter a conversation that might be a little uncomfortable with someone who, might not agree with you. So there's different goals, and thinking about those goals is going to help you define what approach you might want to take. Sometimes you just want to share the findings and excitement of science. Sometimes you just want to get people excited about science. And that's usually, I feel like, at least personally for me, that's always a goal. And then I might also have other goals on top of that, but that's definitely a goal. I feel like professionally and also personally for me, maybe that's like my life's mission, or at least that's what my family says. I don't know if they're very happy about that, but here we are. That's totally fine. Another goal is to increase the appreciation for science as a way of understanding and navigating the world. So not just increasing knowledge, but increasing the appreciation and understanding that science is a way of thinking. It's a way of helping the human condition. It's in our everyday lives, whether it's like, it's helping us in the medical field, it's helping us get from A to B, it's helping us at our work, and just shedding light on how important that is in our lives. Or increasing knowledge, that's more specific. Increasing knowledge and understanding of a science related to a specific issue. So you can definitely have a variety of different goals here. You always want to be considering your audience. And in previous Lunch and Learns, I've talked specifically about your audience in many different ways. There's many different intersections to think about them and their needs and their motivations and how to meet those needs. In this particular one, with thinking about controversial science topics, I kind of want to break it into thinking about 4 different audiences. You're going to have people who are supportive. And with that, so they're going to agree with the conversation or the controversial topic that you're speaking to. So what are their needs? They might want a deeper understanding, and maybe they want to know some action steps, some things that they can do to feel empowered to contribute to some type of solution. You're going to potentially have an unaware audience. Maybe they just did not know about a certain issue. They're more neutral. They weren't supportive. They're not necessarily skeptical. They just really were unaware until that time. And so that's something to consider. For sure, we're going to have some skeptical audience. So these folks often are going to be actually well researched in their own right. And often they just really want to feel heard. And often they're skeptical and they're really well researched because something about that issue is pulling at something that feels like maybe it's pulling at a value that they have. And so really diving in and just kind of learning about that more is one of those approaches that we'll talk about. And then of course, your young audience. I feel like they're their own kind of category because they're really excited to learn. And we really want to be mindful that we are just, you know, that goal of just getting them excited about science. We really employ that goal with them. We really don't want to use doom and gloom or anything with them. That's a bad practice for anybody, but especially for young audience, because we want to at least get them excited into the table first before we talk about really complex subjects. Okay. Checking your expectation. I think this is a really important one as well. And we kind of talked about it a little bit with your role, but just understanding that when whether you are a biologist talking to landowners, or whether you were a science educator doing a presentation or leading a field trip, whether you're a science communicator working at an expo, wherever you may find yourself in these situations, you just need to adjust that expectation for what outcome you want. We're not here to tell people what to think. Just getting someone to think about something in a new light or engaging with an audience about a scientific topic is a successful outcome, just in and of itself. We don't need people to sign an oath saying, okay, I promise I'm gonna start recycling now. I mean, that would be so cool, but that's not gonna happen every time or probably ever, right? If we just get people to start thinking about things and how it's meaningful in their life, that is a success. So don't expect your values or the information that you share to change someone's core belief. If you go in with that expectation, you're going to be disappointed and it's going to be frustrating. Understand the context. Have grace for people's lived experience. This has taken me a while. This is not something that you learn in college. This is something you learn through lived experience yourself, but just understanding that most people have good intentions. It's just, you know, and most people want to understand things, but it's just everyone looks at things through their own lens of what they have experienced. And they always bring that to the table. And so having grace for that and empathy really goes a long way. It's not our role to tell people how to think. It's only our role to present scientific evidence and content. Some basic things to avoid when talking science, and especially complicated science or controversial science topics. Really, you're gonna wanna avoid long drawn out explanations. That's just going to shut down the conversation. It's going to kind of put up a gate. It's going to make it not accessible and maybe even frustrate someone who doesn't understand something fully anyways. Really avoid only using scientific terminology and scientific jargon. So I'm not saying never use scientific words. I do that a lot, even with kiddos, but I make sure I relate it and I make sure I define it and I make it exciting too for them to learn those words. Definitely avoid threats and doom and gloom messaging. Even though sometimes within our agency, you know, we're looking at different projects and different things on the horizon that, you know, they seem scary. We're thinking habitat loss or things like that. Even though we're very passionate and we see these problems and we want to work towards solutions, doom and gloom messaging is never going to help, you know, invite other people there to the table to help us with that solution. It's only going to shut down conversations or scare people or just make people feel like, well, what really can you do? It's going to take the power and agency away from them. So we try to be positive. Data and graphs are great to use, but make sure that that's not the only thing we're using and make sure they're relatable and easily interpreted. Avoid using examples that are only affecting people on a global scale. I have a good example of this one. So I'm gonna think about climate change a lot with controversial science topics, right? For so long, if you think of climate change, maybe if you ask someone like 5 years ago, first thing that might pop in your mind is like a sad polar bear on an iceberg. It's very sad. That evokes lots of emotion. Like, at least for me, I know I love polar bears and care about them, but not everyone does. And what about people in Nebraska? It's not very relatable. It's not right here. And so it's hard for people right here in Nebraska to connect that climate change is going to affect us and is going to affect us right here. And so what I mean by that is you can use examples of global scale, but don't let that be the only thing that you bring into that conversation. You really need to bring it right here to local examples and how it's going to relate to people right in their own backyard as well. And this is a huge one. This takes a lot of patience, and it takes a lot of grace, and it takes a lot of empathy, which can be practiced. But please avoid assuming that a skeptical audience is ignorant or dumb. It's easy to do, and it takes a lot of patience, believe me. But even people, even the horrible comments that like I'll read sometimes on Facebook, that's a practice in patience right there. But you know, it's all coming from a lot of times like fear or different things like that, and just different values. And so we can't go in assuming that anybody is just ignorant and dumb just for that sake. You know, there's always something to learn if we're staying objective and curious. Any questions?
Not yet.
Okay. All right, so I'm gonna dive in now to the methods in practice. And these, like I said, at the end of this, I'll share the resources that I use to put together today's presentation. There's lots of fantastic resources out there. And I compiled many of them. And so I'm gonna share that with everybody if you guys are interested. But I'm gonna go through, I think there's about 8 really good tangible takeaways that we can work through. Some of them have examples, and I'm gonna ask if you'd like to participate. And I don't know if you ever use a Jamboard, but we're gonna do that for some of them. So the first method in practice for having, you know, difficult conversations, especially with science, is finding common values and intentionally framing. So even people on the opposite ends of super polarizing issues, we can find some kind of common principle and value, and that's where you're going to start. For example, myself, I value healthy habitats for the sake of healthy habitats because I love wildlife and I care about the earth and I care about all those things for their own sake, and that's fantastic and that's great. But if I lead every presentation and every educational program and every engagement I have with audience just on that value, because that's my value, that's not going to be very successful in connecting with everyone. Because not everyone shares that same value. I wish that they did, but it's just not the way of the world, and that's okay. But I guarantee you that my value of family, making sure my family's healthy and safe, I guarantee you my value of wanting clean air and water for the people in my community, and values like that, I guarantee you my value of wanting good jobs in my community for people, I bet you that I can relate that to a lot of different people, right? So you can, depending on the situation and the topic that you're talking about, you can always find common principles and values with anyone, and you start there, and that's how you frame the topic. So you connect with that, you use relatable analogies to explain issues, think about simple causal chains that connect to behaviors, and think about framing things that resonate, like I said. So think about like responsible management or future generations, or your legacy, energy independence, healthy populations. An example, let's think of an example. If we wanted people to reduce their carbon footprint, and my value is because I care about the earth and I want people to reduce their carbon footprint so that everything, humans, wildlife, every living creature has a better home. That's great, but someone might want to reduce their carbon footprint in their own home because it's going to save them money if they turn off their lights more often, or if they maybe raise their thermostat by 2 degrees. That's going to save them a little bit of money. It's going to help with my value a little bit, but it's going to save them a little money. So what can we frame this as that it's going to help connect them with something that they value? Does that make sense? With that, I have a prompt for everybody. So I'm going to see if this is going to work. So I'm going to share a link in the chat, and it's just a Jamboard. If you guys would like to click on the link, and then what you're going to see is an example. And this is a scenario that I feel like maybe some of us in the agency could have been in before. And so I want you to just be brainstorming this and thinking about this. Talking with a farmer about the benefits of enrolling in CRP or a similar program, but she's not necessarily interested in helping to enhance habitat for wildlife. What other values can you frame the conversation with instead? So what you want to do, and Grace, can you see my mouse cursor?
Yep, it's perfect.
Okay. So if you all can see this, if you click right here on sticky note, you should be able to type a note right here and then press save. And then you can move it. And so you can add your comment to here, and then we can kind of look and see what people's thoughts are on this scenario. So I'm going to give you just maybe like a minute or so to think about this, and if you'd like to add something here to this conversation. What other value could we frame this conversation? Chatting with a farmer about, the benefits of enrolling their farm in a CRP or a similar program. Oh, this is good stuff. Okay, so far we have guaranteed income, so that's great. Economic benefits to their operation, financial benefit, economic gain for marginal land, very good. So that's kind of in that category. Someone said less impact on the soil, allowing for protection of needed topsoil for future crop planting. So that's good. Maybe that's like long-term, thinking about their own crop long-term, right? Potential for grazing, this is good. By planting better plant species, they may have healthier livestock. That's really good. So you're thinking about framing it for them and what's important to them, even though it's also going to help wildlife, which is important to us. Ooh, family hunting opportunity, potential for hay. This is really good. It's excellent. Maybe just a few more seconds and then I'll move on. Awesome. This is fantastic. Thank you everybody for contributing to that. I'm going to go ahead and switch back to the presentation. And hopefully that got you thinking about. Grace, let me know what you can see.
Yep, we're back to finding common values.
Okay, sweet. Okay. All right, the next one. So simplifying the science and finding the tangibles. So taking a big kind of maybe like a complex science phenomena and stripping it down into parts, basically taking a big puzzle that will be harder for someone who's not in the scientific field to really digest and understand and make it relatable, and just taking the pieces apart and kind of showing them one by one. And what I might mean by that is, for example, if we're talking about like this sentence right here, habitat loss is leading to a decline in grassland bird species in North America. That's a really big concept. That's a really big kind of phenomena to think about if I'm not in this field. What do I do with this information? How do I make it relate to me? How do I even understand it? Is there anything I can do? That's just a big kind of picture idea. But if we think about it, and even if we take, let's say we take the word habitat and we break that down, and I should have quizzed you guys, but I didn't. That's okay. I'll give you this one. So what's in habitat? It's right there on the screen. 4 things make up habitat: food, water, shelter, space. So if you break this sentence down and then you focus on maybe what are these birds' food sources and what's happening there? What's the story there? What's the narrative of the food sources? Well, a lot of times it's insects. So what's happening to the insect population in the grasslands, right? And so like breaking it down into kind of smaller, more tangible bites. What's happening? What's going on in the water sources or the shelter or the space? This is just kind of like a crude example, but it's taking something that's big and complex and taking and stripping it down and making it, you know, really those puzzle pieces so it doesn't feel so abstract. If anyone has any other examples of this or any ideas, feel free to let me know. You can unmute yourself or add it into the chat at any time. I'd love if anyone has some ideas. Okay, the power of positive emotion. So this one's really important. This one is I touched on it a little bit with that. It's the opposite of gloom and doom, right? So we want to making sure that we are being uplifting and inspiring, even when we're talking about scary stuff. I'm not going to lie to you. Talking about climate change, especially to students, it's an important thing. We need to be talking about it, but it's a very scary subject. And because it's so big, it feels so big and heavy and global. But what you can do is you can be thinking about it in new ways, and you present it in opportunities to be innovative, opportunities to be creative, paint creative visions of our future, thinking about job growth and different things that we can do, and maybe you're talking about like how we can become energy independent, and just any way you can pull out the positive things for people to be more empowered, or action steps they can take to feel like they can have that agency. We want to create opportunities for emotional connection, especially for younger students. We want to really focus on that because we want them to feel like they have a seat at the table first, to be participating in those conversations in the future. Your attitude and presence are really important. This is a tool that's easy. It's just a thinking about your own frame of mind. And so it's important to remember that people remember more how that you make them feel than what you say. And so if you come off, let's say you're having a conversation about a science, maybe you're a subject matter expert, and maybe you're talking about your latest research or something. If you come off as excited and passionate and excited to share, if you come off with some humility, if you come off with enthusiasm, that's going to get people excited as well. If you come off with more, maybe like, I don't want to say the word snobby because I don't want to paint that picture, but that really is that goes to the distrust of science and science experts sometimes is people tend to the trust goes down if they think that if they're like elitist and things like that. So that attitude and that warm and welcoming, inviting people to participate in those conversations is really important. And then being present, staying objective, being open-minded and curious while engaging, even when engaging with people who aren't going to agree with you. I just feel like we can learn something from anybody, even those who don't agree with us, if we stay curious and open-minded. Analogies are really, really helpful. They're like the golden thing, at least in science education. Use the familiar to explain the unfamiliar, bridging the gap and making it relatable. So use something simple and objective to explain something more complex that might elicit a higher emotional defensive reaction. So for example, if I think about climate change and I'm talking to someone about it, instead of talking about greenhouse gases and all these things that are complex and maybe kind of spark emotion, I might say the atmosphere just likes to hold heat in, which is great for our Earth. We like that we have that atmosphere because it allows us to live here on Earth. It's kind of like, have you ever had a warm blanket on a cold night? And we put that warm blanket on and it's insulating and it keeps us warm and it has that insulating effect. And so it's really similar to that. And then just what's happening is the heat source underneath is increasing. And so what happens if the heat source under that warm blanket is increasing and it can't escape? And so something as simple as that can help people understand those complex ideas in a more meaningful way. Asking questions is really important, and it's important for two reasons. Number one, it's going to help you understand your audience better, which is going to help you understand what approach you might use and understand what values that they have and what common ground you might share. And it's going to be engaging, and it's going to come off in an engaging way as well. But it's also going to help them think about the issue or the conversation that you're having, and it's going to help them think about it personally and how it relates to their own life. So for example, if you're teaching students about recycling or carbon footprint or something, you can ask them, how do you think you can save energy in your own home? And then it'll get them thinking, you know, about their day-to-day lives and like things that they can do to take the scientific phenomena of carbon footprint and think about it in their own daily lives. Self-referencing a narrative is really important. Making it personal. It seems a bit counterintuitive, especially in science, but people are recognizing it's more and more effective and more important to really put the you in the story of your science. People relate better to people than they do to abstract concepts. And so weaving pieces of your own experiences, if it relates to the topic, really helps them relate to that information and think about it in their own lives. And really thinking about that narrative, thinking about it as a story and how it's conveyed, helps people think about their own narratives. I think that I have touched on this in every subject, but I can't stress it enough. Relate, relate, relate. If someone cannot figure out a way that what you are talking about does not relate to their daily lives, they simply don't have the time or the capacity to care about it. And if they don't care about it, they're not going to take action, or they're not going to do the things that maybe we would want them to do. So sharing stories and examples of how whatever we're talking about affects people locally, and thinking about those values, centering your narrative around those common values. Again, I just want to reiterate how important that is. And then just engaging with your audience, asking them how it relates to their life, and being an active listener, because we can learn something from everyone. It's really important. Are there any other methods or ways that have worked for anyone else? I want to ask before I move on to the last slide. You can even be thinking about fun conversations you've had at family holiday dinners too. I'm sure that maybe some of these methods have been employed as well. Okay, so reflection and questions. So I want to ask you, I want to gauge, how do you feel the public's trust in science has been trending over the last half century? So I'm going to launch a poll. And Grace, can you see that poll?
I cannot see that.
Okay. Let me try again. It's like frozen.
Oh, there it is.
Oh, is it going? Okay.
Yep.
Okay, so if you'd like to share what your guess is, what your thought. I do have an answer to this, so I want to see what people think though. So do you feel the trust has been steadily increasing? Has it been fairly stable? Has it been decreasing? Okay, a few more seconds. All right. So, oh, this is just kind of slow. Okay, share results. All right, so it seems like most of you guessed that the trust has been steadily decreasing over the last half century. And 3 thought stable, and then just 1 increasing. So I thought the same thing, and I was actually really surprised to find that it's been fairly stable. That was a really surprising thing. And it just goes to show, thinking about what I had said earlier on the way that science news and science topics are framed in the media. Often they are framed as very polarizing issues when maybe they're just less polarizing than we like to believe, is something that I've been thinking about, because it's been fairly stable over the last 50 years, which is really interesting. In fact, if you look at this is a poll, a Pew Research poll that was done in 2018. And the scientific community is the second most trusted community out of the different communities that they polled on. Military was the top. And then medicine was under science community, education was below that, press was all the way at the bottom. That's kind of interesting. And then the second poll, let's see, let me launch this. How do you feel the response of the scientific community to the pandemic has impacted people's trust in the scientific community? You feel it's increased people's trust overall? Has it not impacted their trust? Or has it decreased people's trust? Just a few more seconds. Okay, so again, most of you guessed that the response of the scientific community has decreased the public's trust. And some of you thought maybe increased and some not impacted at all. I have to say that's probably what I thought as well, where in fact, it has increased people's trust. So this was just the latest. This is a really cool survey that was just done, State of Science Index survey. And before the pandemic, the answer to the question, science is very important to my everyday life, 44% of Americans agreed with that. And after the pandemic, 56%. And then science skepticism is at its lowest point since tracking began. This tracking began in 2018, this particular survey, but it was an 8-point drop just in 1 year from pre-pandemic to post, or to now to 2021. So that's really interesting to me. And one last really exciting thing, and I'm just showing this for you because I just want people to think about, the way that science is talked about and in our social media networks and the media and other things, is we're really led to believe that science is really polarizing and there's way more controversy out there. And maybe we should just stay away from things. But I guess what I'm trying to say is it's best to just maybe lean into those conversations, feel confident to do so, and feel confident to be empowered to have that civil discourse, because it's not as polarizing as we're led to believe. In fact, this was really cool to see. The question of, do people feel that science unites us more than it divides us? 67% of Americans polled feel that science unifies people with opposing views, over 33% that feel that it divides us. So it's just something really interesting to think about, and something I want to leave everybody with, that if we aren't afraid to have those conversations, and I'm not talking just, day to day at work, I'm talking, with your neighbors and your family and your friends. I know I'm trying to be better at it. And just employing those methods, just listening more, and just finding those common values, being empathetic and being curious. We can all learn something and maybe hopefully shed more light on, increasing that scientific literacy, and just leaning into having those conversations about science. Okay, these are a lot of the resources that I used for this presentation. There's a lot of really cool resources out there. If anyone's interested in any of them, please let me know. But I can send them in my final email. And are there any questions for me?
There's nothing in the chat currently, but if anybody wants to throw something in there, they definitely could.
Okay. Well, again, I will send out an evaluation, and this will be recorded and will be available. And so I'll send that out as well. But thank you everyone for participating today, and thank you for your participation in the polls and the Jamboard. That was really helpful and helped the presentation as well. Okay. All right, thank you. Have a good day, everybody.
We'll see ya.